My uncle's voice is the kind that cuts a man twice once when he says the words, and again when the silence afterward lets them settle in. It was at Grandpa's dining table, the one I'd helped sand and finish with my own hands, where he leaned forward and smirked. "You'll never see a dollar from Grandpa," he said. His teeth were yellowed from years of cheap cigars, but that smirk gleamed as if he'd won some prize I didn't even know I was playing for. The others laughed. My cousins, my aunt, even a neighbor who had no business being at the table. They laughed because my uncle had a way of setting the tone, and when he laughed, they all followed like dogs chasing the same bone. I didn't laugh. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer slowly, the way Grandpa used to do, and I let the silence stretch. My uncle thought silence meant I agreed with him. What he never understood is that silence is a ledger. It keeps track. The smell of old oak and varnish still hung in that room. I remembered the years I spent beside Grandpa sanding planks, hauling lumber, listening to him talk about how a man's work outlives his body. He'd always said I had his hands, not my uncle. Strong hands, steady hands, the kind that could measure twice and cut once. But my uncle had the voice. And sometimes, in families, the loudest voice carries more weight than the steadiest hands. That night, I drove home in my old pickup, the heater whining, the headlights dim on the back road, and I thought about the way Grandpa used to pat my shoulder after a long day. "You'll do fine, Len," he'd say. He never told me I'd be rich, but he told me I'd be fine. When I pulled into my driveway, snow crunching under the tires, I sat for a long while with the engine off. The house was dark, quiet. My uncle's laughter was still in my ears. And that was when I knew I wouldn't fight him in that dining room. I wouldn't shout or plead. I would wait, because time, like silence, has a weight of its own. The smirk, the laughter, the insult carved into memory. That's where my revenge began, not with papers, not with deeds, but with the decision to keep my mouth shut until the right moment. I didn't sleep that night. The house clicked and settled in the cold, pipes ticking like distant footsteps, the fridge humming its small stubborn hum. I sat at the kitchen table with the old ledger Grandpa had given me when I was 20, its cover cracked, the corners rounded by time. He'd said, "Every man should keep a book. Not for money, though. Money listens to ink, but for truth." I slid a pen along the margin and wrote one simple line. He said I'd never see a dollar. Then I underlined the date. Silence is a ledger. Now it had its first entry. In the morning, the world looked like the inside of a glass bottle, thin light, everything dulled. I brewed coffee the way he taught me. Measured, patient, water just off the boil so it didn't burn the grounds. "The first cup is always for steadiness," he'd say. "The second is for thinking." I took both in my truck, thermos rattling in the cup holder, and drove the long way to town because there are roads where a man can rehearse a face one that doesn't break when someone laughs. My uncle's hardware store sits on the corner where the brick turns to clapboard, and the streetlights are still the old green hoods with flaking paint. He'd stolen more than a sentence at that table. He'd stolen the tone of the street. People greeted him like a foreman, not a brother. I parked across from the store and watched through the windshield as he lifted the metal gate, one side at a time, shoulders hunched with false effort. He liked to perform his labor early, when there were witnesses. I don't judge a man for wanting to be seen. I judge him for how he treats what he can't see: quiet work, old debts, the hands that made his steps easier. I didn't go in. I let the engine tick as it cooled and studied the second-floor windows above the store, the ones with the warped glass that turns snowflakes into crooked stars. Grandpa replaced those panes after the storm of 2089. I was there, steadying the ladder. When we finished, he ran his finger along a bead of putty and said, "It holds because we meant it to." There are sentences that hold just like that, even when a man tries to scrape them off with his fingernail. "You'll do fine, Len." That one never chipped. By noon, the town was awake. Delivery trucks backing into alleys, the bakery's door propped open with a sack of flour, heat rolling out with the smell of sugar and yeast. I went in for a cinnamon roll I didn't need and told myself it was fuel. The baker's wife asked about Grandpa, her voice softening at the edges. I nodded. Words are heavy in small places. You lift them carefully or you break something. Outside, the wind came sideways, biting through my jacket. I drove to Grandpa's house and parked at the curb, not in the driveway. Not today, because grief has rules. And one of them is you approach the old place like a stranger, until it lets you in. The porch boards creaked the same way they always had, board 3 from the left singing a half step higher like a stubborn violin string. I held the railing, felt the cold iron in my palm, and remembered painting it with Grandpa one 4th of July, while my cousins lit sparklers and ran yelling in the yard. He didn't rush the corners. Corners tell the truth about a paint job, he'd said. Brush slow, careful. My uncle paints with a roller and calls it done. Inside, the house was staged for mourning. Casserole dishes on the counter. Jackets thrown over chairbacks. Half-empty glasses sweating onto coasters. My aunt moved through the rooms like a hostess at a wake-themed banquet. Her smile practiced, her eyes calculating who was worth a hug. The key bowl by the door, Grandpa's blue ceramic catch-all, was full of strangers' car keys and a few house keys I recognized by their wear patterns. Keys tell their own stories. The smoothest ones belong to doors used often and kindly. My uncle's key was shiny, new, untouched by weather or worry. Len, my aunt said, and she said it like the name was a small object she'd lost and found under the couch. Dusty, not worth polishing. He'd want you to take whatever tools you left here. I didn't leave them, I said, gentle. I brought them. There's a difference. She blinked, as if the air had changed temperature and she hadn't dressed for it. My uncle appeared in the doorway with a clipboard, of all things, as if the house were a job site and grief a task list. Sign here if you take anything, he said. We're keeping a record. We are, I said. Good. He didn't like the way I smiled. Bullies prefer flinches. He moved closer, the sour leather smell of his coat mixing with cologne he'd never earned. And I meant what I said last night, he added, voice low enough to be mistaken for kindness if you weren't listening. It'll be simpler if you don't expect things. I nodded as if he'd given weather advice. Expectation is a public act. Ik heb mine privat. I went to the garage, the old temple, where the air still held a sacrament of oil and pine dust. The workbench had my initials carved under the lip, small and hidden, done with a utility blade when I was 14 and wanted proof I existed where my hands worked. My hammer lay where I'd left it 2 weeks earlier, its handle dark with the kind of polish only years can give. Sweat, time, 1,000 small decisions to keep going. I picked it up and weighed it in my palm. A tool knows the weight of a man's day. I set it down again, then lifted Grandpa's carpenter square and slid it into my coat, not stealing, not hiding claiming. I'd bought it for him on my first good payday. Gifts, unlike inheritances, don't get read out loud. As I turned, my uncle filled the doorway, silhouette cut out by the bright rectangle of winter light behind him. Taking anything? He asked casually, pen poised. Memories, I said. They don't fit on your list. He clicked the pen and scribbled anyway, a sound too loud in the holy garage. He never understood that writing down a thing doesn't make it true, the same way laughing at a lie doesn't make it honest. I walked past him. He stepped aside, but not enough, so my shoulder brushed his. I kept my eyes on the floor and counted the knots in the boards. 1, 2, 3. A man can choose what to count. The afternoon thinned. People left in clusters, coats gathered, voices lowered, promises to call made and already forgotten. My aunt stacked the casserole dishes by size. My uncle argued with a cousin about snow removal, as if control over a driveway proved anything about a man. I stood in the doorway to the dining room and looked at the table again, the one I'd finished with Grandpa, the one that held his elbows when he taught me how to read a contract line by line, as if it were a map. He'd traced each section with his finger and said, "It's not words you're reading, it's intentions. People tell you who they are in the clauses they think you won't notice." I noticed. I always noticed. I just hadn't spoken. As dusk pressed itself against the windows, I pretended to adjust a curtain and studied the street. Across the way, the old boarding house sat with its mouth shut and its eyes down the windows boarded on the side alley. A for sale sign slumped against the steps, half buried in snow. It had been that way for months, maybe years. In a town like ours, buildings that don't know their purpose become rumors. I filed it in the same ledger where I kept Hurt. The boarding house wasn't Hurt. It was opportunity wearing a tired coat. When I left, no one noticed. Grief is loud at first, but departures are quiet. I stood on the porch, breath making brief ghosts, and slid my hands into my pockets. My fingers closed around the carpenter's square and something steadied in me, not anger, not satisfaction. Alignment. I walked to the truck without looking back, because some scenes don't deserve the dignity of a final glance. The road home was a long gray ribbon with stitch marks of salt where the plows had passed. I drove below the limit and listened to the rattle in the dash that only happens when the temperature drops under 20. When I reached my driveway, I didn't go inside. I stood in the cold with the map of the town in my head, street by street, property by property, names attached to deeds, deeds attached to mortgages, mortgages attached to men who think signatures are just ink. The trick isn't to know everything. The trick is to know what matters long enough for neglect to do the rest. Inside, I opened the ledger again. Page 2. I wrote, "Find the records, not to contest yet, to understand." Then, lower. "A thing can be taken from you in public and returned to you in private." I closed the book and rested my palm on it, the way Grandpa used to settle his hand over fresh concrete to feel the heat of cure. Truth sets like that, slow, exothermic, inevitable. I washed my cup, wiped the counter, shut the light. In the dark, the house felt honest. It made no promises, asked for nothing, stood where it stood. Tomorrow I would do the same, and when the time came, I wouldn't ask for $1. I would ask for the thing underneath dollars, the thing my uncle can't measure with a clipboard. Before the lawyers, before the reading, before the month where the first check would change hands, there was this: a boy in a workshop, a square in his pocket, and a grandfather's voice showing him where true edges live and how to hold them. Grandpa always said the past is heavy, but it balances you if you carry it right. I didn't understand him back then. I thought he meant lumber, the kind of weight you stack on your shoulders until your knees give. But now I know he meant memory, the kind you don't set down, the kind that shapes the way you stand even when no one's watching. I was 17 when I first followed him to the courthouse. He wore his Sunday jacket, not because he cared about looks, but because he cared about respect. He said a man dresses the way he wants to be treated, not the way he is. The clerk barely looked at me, just waved me to a bench. Grandpa stood at the counter, hat in his hand, voice steady as he asked for deed records. Later, over hot dogs from a cart, he told me, "Everything has paper. You lose the paper, you lose the thing. You keep it, you own it twice, once in your hand, once in the law's memory." That line never left me. Paper has its own memory. I grew up working for him, but not for money. He paid me in habits, small ones that felt useless then, but built something in me like joists under a floor. Wake before the sun. Check your tools before you use them. Sweep the site clean even if no one will see. I remember sanding boards until my wrists ached, wondering why we couldn't leave the rough edges if they were going to be nailed where no one could see. He just smiled and said, "You'll see." I saw years later, when my uncle called me the family handyman. He thought it was an insult. He didn't understand it was a title I'd earned with every splinter and scar. Back then, I worked jobs no one noticed. Repairs on houses that had seen better days. Railings, steps, gutters, always the same. The call came from someone who couldn't afford the big contractor, and I showed up with a quiet nod, a box of tools, and patience. My uncle never bothered with jobs like those too small, no glory. He sold high-ticket tools at his store, crowing about being a businessman. But I learned more watching water find its way through a rotted sill than he ever did standing behind a counter. And Grandpa, he noticed. I can still smell the shop on a winter morning. Cedar dust, pipe tobacco, cold iron. He'd stand by the stove with his mug, steam curling up to his weathered face, and he'd say, "A man who knows wood knows people. Both swell, both crack. Both last if you care for them." He taught me to oil hinges until they whispered instead of screamed. He taught me to set a nail so clean it looked like it grew there. Those lessons weren't about wood. They were about patience. The sacrifice was this: I gave my youth to work, while my cousins gave theirs to parties and vacations. I stayed when I could have left. I fixed when I could have ignored. I carried when I could have begged off. And I did it because I thought, naive as I was, that loyalty would be returned. But loyalty is a strange currency in families. Some see it as wealth. Others see it as weakness. My uncle saw mine as both. He let me do the sweating, then called it chores. He let me miss chances for schooling, then called me uneducated. He let me stay close to Grandpa, then called me clingy. I gave years, and he twisted them into excuses to dismiss me. The night Grandpa passed, I was the one at his bedside. His hands, once strong enough to lift beams without a wince, had thinned to bones under parchment skin. He whispered to me, voice cracked but still carrying the weight of oak, "Don't argue with fools, Len. Let them make noise. You keep steady. The line finds you in the end." I nodded, but tears blurred my sight. His eyes closed before mine did. I buried my grief in work the next morning, hammer in hand, boards measured true. I thought the world would honor the man who'd built half the town. I thought the family would recognize who'd been beside him. But the will proved otherwise. And yet, when the words cut, when my uncle's smirk cut deeper, I remembered something small. Grandpa had once told me never to throw away a square piece of scrap wood. One day you'll need it to shim something, he'd said. Revenge, I realized, is the same. Every slight, every insult, keep it stacked neatly in a corner. Someday, it fills the gap under a sagging beam. I carried the past like that, quiet, balanced, patient, and while my uncle believed I was too beaten down to rise, I was already shaping memory into a tool sharper than any blade in his store. Because my sacrifice wasn't wasted. It was invested. And interest, like silence, grows while others sleep. There's a quiet rhythm to sacrifice. You don't notice it while you're living it, only later. When you look back and see the places where your life bent for others and never bent back. I see it in the houses I built with Grandpa. Not the fine ones, not the ones with brass numbers on the doors and polished driveways, but the modest homes where kids tracked mud on the porch and the mothers paid us with pie when they couldn't afford cash. My cousins never lifted a hammer on those jobs. They thought they were beneath them. But Grandpa said, "A house doesn't care who lives in it, Len. It just wants to stand." Standing is what I learned. Sacrifice is what it cost. When I was 24, I had an offer to leave town. A contractor downstate needed a foreman. Good money, steady work. I thought about it for weeks. One night I mentioned it to Grandpa over stew. He stirred his bowl slowly, then said, "You do well there. But I'll tell you this, no one remembers the man who leaves. They remember the one who stays." I stayed. I told myself it was loyalty, that I was honoring him. But there were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd thrown my future into the dirt, just to prove I could keep holding a post no one else wanted. Sacrifice can feel noble in daylight and foolish in the dark. My uncle never sacrificed. He took. He wore the title of eldest son like a crown, though he never earned it. He let Grandpa's name open doors, while I carried lumber through the back ones. He sat at tables with bankers, while I sat on beams with blisters. And when I came home sore and covered in sawdust, he'd grin like he knew a secret. "You've got strong arms, Lynn," he'd say. "Good for carrying the rest of us." I carried. I carried through winters when work was thin, and Grandpa's back went out. I carried through springs when roofs leaked, and he was too proud to call anyone but me. I carried even when I could have dropped the load and said, "No more." But you don't say that to a man who raised you. You say, "I've got it." I thought he'd make it clear in the will that he'd seen, that he'd measured my weight against my uncle's words and balanced the scale. Instead, when the lawyer opened the folder, it was all typed neat. Every line feeding my uncle's pride. I got nothing but silence. And the silence wasn't Grandpa's, it was paper's. Paper that remembered, but not in my favor. The sting wasn't the money. I'd never had much. The sting was hearing my uncle chuckle in the back of the lawyer's office, as if the world itself had confirmed his smug prophecy. "See, Len," he whispered when no one was looking. "Even the old man knew better than to trust you with anything." That's when the past shifted. My sacrifices stopped being a burden. They became evidence. Every late night, every bent nail pulled and replaced. Every board cut true, each one was a page in a book my uncle hadn't read yet. He thought the ledger was closed because he'd skimmed the will. But my ledger, the one Grandpa gave me, was still open. And I had been writing in it for years. The entries weren't just insults or grievances. They were moments of teaching. How to brace a beam with nothing but rope and grit. How to read the grain of a plank. How to square a frame by trusting diagonals instead of eyes. Lessons invisible to a man like my uncle, who thought money was the only teacher. Sacrifice is a strange inheritance. It doesn't pay in dollars. It pays in the quiet confidence that you can outlast men who only live for the applause. That night, after the will, I sat at my own table. I traced my finger over the line I'd written. He said I'd never see a dollar, and I added beneath it. But I saw the work, and the work remembers me. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when, but I knew the past hadn't wasted itself. Sacrifice was waiting, like a foundation under dirt, ready for walls no one else could imagine standing. Because I had one thing my uncle never had: time. And time is the only witness who never forgets. Betrayal doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it walks in wearing polished shoes, carrying a manila folder, and clears its throat in a lawyer's office. That's how mine came. The day of the will reading, the winter sky pressed low, gray as slate. I parked my truck between two shiny sedans outside the attorney's office. My boots tracked in salt and slush on the polished tile floor. My uncle gave me a look that said exactly what his mouth later confirmed. "You don't belong here." We sat in stiff-backed chairs, the air thick with the smell of leather portfolios and stale coffee. The lawyer, a thin man with glasses perched too far down his nose, cleared his throat and began reading. His voice was flat, without mercy. Property after property. Account after account, my uncle's name was spoken. His smirk grew with every sentence. My cousins shifted in their chairs, trading glances, suppressing grins. By the time the lawyer closed the folder, the silence in that room was worse than any outburst could have been. I didn't see my name. Not once. My uncle leaned toward me, elbow brushing mine, and whispered through his yellowed grin, "Told you. Not a dollar. Not even a nail." The room chuckled in little bursts. They thought it was harmless teasing. But it was a cut. And cuts like that don't bleed right away. They sink deep, under the skin, until they ache with every breath. I didn't speak. I looked at the lawyer, nodded once, and rose. My chair scraped the floor, sharp in the silence. My uncle thought I was leaving in shame. Truth was, I was leaving to breathe, because the air in that office had soured with greed. Outside, the wind stung my face, but it felt cleaner than the smirks inside. I stood on the steps, the will's verdict still echoing in my head. It wasn't about money. It was about being erased. About years of sacrifice weighed, measured, and dismissed as nothing. On the walk back to my truck, I caught my reflection in the glass of the office door. My hair, streaked white at the temples, my shoulders still broad from decades of labor, my face lined with the map of days worked and nights endured. That reflection reminded me of something Grandpa once told me. A man can't be written out if he's carved himself into the wood of a place. I had carved myself in, board by board, nail by nail. My uncle just didn't see it yet. I drove through town slowly, watching the buildings pass, the old boarding house with its sagging porch, the diner with its flickering sign, the rental apartments with cracked shutters. Properties, all of them had papers tucked in drawers downtown, deeds, liens, mortgages. My uncle thought a signature on a will was the end of the story. He forgot that every story has footnotes, and sometimes the footnotes tell the truth better than the headline. That night, I couldn't eat. I sat with the ledger open, pen in hand. The page looked back at me, blank but patient. I wrote, "Erased on paper, but not in memory. Let paper be the battlefield. Let silence be the weapon." And as the ink dried, I realized something. My uncle had won a prize he couldn't carry. He'd taken on more than he understood. Property isn't a trophy, it's a weight. And he'd just strapped a millstone around his own neck. I closed the book. I didn't slam it. Quiet things last longer. Because the betrayal wasn't the end. It was only the invitation. And I intended to RSVP in my own time. The betrayal deepened in the weeks that followed. Not because of the ink on the will, but because of the way my uncle carried it like a flag. He made sure the town knew. At the diner, he sat by the window with his coffee, voice raised just enough for nearby tables to hear. The old man left it all to me. Said I was the only one who could handle it. He laughed, shaking his head, as if it were a burden he carried out of generosity. Folks nodded politely, not daring to cross him. But I saw the way their eyes flickered toward me when I walked in, the unspoken pity in their glances. At the hardware store, he added a new sign, Callahan and Son. There was no son, only his pride dressed up as legacy. He paraded the name as if it were a birthright, when the truth was, it had been built with Grandpa's hands and mine. The and Son should have been me, but he wore it like armor. And at family gatherings, funerals have a way of breeding birthdays, weddings, and all the rest. He found ways to remind me. A smirk when bills were settled. A pat on the back heavy with false sympathy. One night, over roast beef at my cousin's house, he raised his glass and said, "To family those who build it and those who just fix the cracks." Everyone laughed. I didn't. Each word, each gesture was another nail. Not in my coffin, but in his. Because while he boasted, I listened. While he bragged, I counted. And while he walked the town like a king, I walked the alleys, the back streets, the quiet corners where paper speaks louder than pride. I went to the courthouse, just as Grandpa had taught me. The clerk was older now, but she still remembered him. "Always so polite," she said, sliding a stack of dusty folders across the counter. "Always thorough." I flipped through deeds, mortgages, liens. My uncle's name appeared often, but not alone. There were banks, lenders, co-signers, debts folded like laundry no one cared to put away. The man who claimed to own everything was, in truth, owned by the very signatures he thought crowned him. I copied numbers, dates, and addresses. Each line I wrote in my ledger felt like a breath of clean air after years in smoke. I didn't need to invent anything. I only needed to notice. Grandpa had said, "People tell you who they are in the clauses they think you won't read." My uncle's arrogance had written volumes. Back home, I laid the papers out on the table. My kitchen smelled of coffee grounds and pine cleaner, the hum of the fridge steady like a metronome. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, muting the world. Inside, the silence sharpened until it hummed. I read every page twice, slowly, patiently, and the picture formed. My uncle had inherited the house, the land, the rental units, but he had also inherited the taxes, the repairs, the mortgages. He had grabbed the crown, but it was made of lead. That's when the betrayal shifted inside me. It was no longer just a wound. It became a seed. I realized I didn't need to fight him head on. I didn't need to demand what was rightfully mine. All I needed was time, and time was already bending the scales. Every first of the month, a property demands its due taxes, rent, upkeep. Every missed nail, every unpaid balance, every ignored repair becomes a crack. And cracks, as I knew from years of carpentry, don't shout, they whisper, until the whole structure falls. I sat back, closed the ledger, and placed my hand flat on the cover. The kitchen light reflected in the worn leather like a small flame. He thought he had written me out, but he had only written himself into a contract with weight, deadlines, and consequences. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to raise my voice. All I needed was to wait for the calendar to turn. And when it did, he would learn what silence sounds like when it comes knocking. A countermove doesn't begin with noise. It begins with a whiz, per Pascal, per S, lighting across a counter, a clerk's stamp pressing ink into permanence, a handshake that doesn't make the evening news. That was how mine began. I started with the boarding house across from Grandpa's place. The one sagging, half forgotten, its porch leaning like a drunk at last call. Most people saw an eyesore. I saw a ledger entry waiting to be written. The bank had foreclosed years back, and it sat idle bleeding money the bank wanted to stop. All I had to do was ask the right questions. So, I did. I walked into the courthouse, the same office where my uncle had grinned like a fox while the will erased me. This time, I didn't sit in the back row. I went straight to the counter. "Records on the boarding house, please," I said. The clerk, a different one than before, shuffled through files and frowned. "It's on the books, but no bids in 2 years. Maintenance liens piling up." "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said, lowering her voice, "they'll sell to anyone who promises to pay the taxes." I nodded. Promises were something I was good at keeping. Within a month, I had the deed. No fanfare, no headlines, just a quiet line in the county's memory. Leonard Callahan, owner. I didn't tell a soul. Not my cousins, not a neighbor, not even the folks at the diner who'd noticed me carrying lumber in the back of my truck. I worked evenings and weekends, patching, sanding, painting. My hands remembered every lesson Grandpa taught me: corners, patience, finished the unseen parts as carefully as the rest. By spring, the boarding house wasn't sagging anymore. By summer, it was rented, one apartment at a time. I charged fair, lower than the market, and word spread fast. Folks moved in with relief on their faces. Rent flowed in like water finding its level. And with each check, I felt the weight of my uncle's words lighten. Never see a dollar. He was wrong already. But that was just the first step. Because while I was hammering nails and painting trim, I was also collecting information. Every building my uncle bragged about, I checked. Every property with his name on it, I traced. He had them all, yes, but with them, he had their debts. He hadn't counted on taxes rising. He hadn't counted on tenants falling behind. He hadn't counted on roofs sagging, furnaces failing, siding rotting. Property, like wood, demands care. And my uncle, loud as he was, had never learned to listen. I began filing notices. Nothing dramatic, just quiet filings, one by one. Liens here, inquiries there, requests for copies of mortgage terms, tax assessments, repair permits. Each document a brick in a wall he didn't even know was being built. At night, I sat with the ledger, filling page after page. Not in anger, in detail. Address, date, debt, like a carpenter measuring boards for a frame no one else can see yet. One evening, after a long day of sanding trim, I sat on the porch of the boarding house. The air smelled of fresh paint and lilacs blooming wild along the fence. Across the street, Grandpa's old house stood in shadows, porch light off, windows dark. My uncle hadn't even fixed the broken shutter that banged in the wind. I thought of Grandpa, how he'd taught me to square a frame by trusting diagonals, not my eyes. "You can't fight crooked by yelling at it," he'd said. "You correct it, slowly, with quiet pressure, until it learns to stand straight." That was what I was doing now, not yelling, correcting. And one day soon, my uncle's crooked pride would learn to stand in my shadow. Every man has a blind spot. My uncle's was pride. He believed possession was the same as mastery. He thought because the papers named him, the town would always bow to him. But paper doesn't just grant ownership, it demands responsibility. That was the part he never understood. The first crack appeared with the Maple Street apartments. A tired 3-story brick building, windows clouded, stair railings loose. I knew that place well. I'd fixed his gutters back when Grandpa still walked with me on jobs. My uncle inherited it, and he bragged about it more than any other property. Solid brick, he'd say at the diner. A cash cow. But a building is only as solid as the care it gets. He didn't know the roof leaked. I did. He didn't know the boiler rattled and coughed. I'd heard it with my own ears while fixing a tenant's door. And he didn't know the tenants were tired of calling a landlord who never showed. They still called me, out of habit, and I quietly showed up. I fixed what I could. Tightened a railing, patched a hole, replaced a lock. I didn't charge a cent. I just kept the calls logged in my ledger, each one a note in a song my uncle didn't realize was playing. When winter came, the heat failed for good. Tenants complained. The city inspector came. My uncle shrugged it off, confident that fines were just paper. He paid one, late, then ignored the rest. Pride makes a man believe deadlines bend for him, but the city doesn't bend. I watched. I waited. Then came the tax auction notice, published in the smallest corner of the local paper. Properties behind on taxes would be listed. The Maple Street apartments were among them. My uncle never saw it. Men like him don't read the small print. They skim for their own names in bold. I went to the courthouse again. My boots tracked snow on the marble floor, same as always. I filed the forms. I wrote the checks. And when the gavel came down at the auction, the building that had been his favorite brag became mine. No one in the family knew. Not yet. I didn't announce it. I didn't strut. I just walked the block one evening, looking at those windows lit yellow in the dusk, hearing the hum of tenants cooking dinner, children laughing behind thin walls. They didn't know either, but they would. Not because I wanted their thanks, but because I wanted them steady, safe, warm. That was how Grandpa taught me to hold a house. The first rent checks came folded in envelopes, slipped under the door of the office I'd set up in the boarding house. When I wrote my name in the ledger that night, Len Callahan, landlord, Maple Street, the ink looked darker than any line before. I thought about my uncle sitting at the diner, slapping his palm on the counter, telling stories about his building. I wondered how long it would take before someone corrected him. I wondered how red his face would turn when the truth found him. But he didn't rush it. Revenge, like carpentry, requires patience. You don't nail a joint before the glue sets. You wait. You let time do its part. Then you drive the nail home, clean and flush. For now, I kept silent. I fixed the boiler. I patched the roof. I visited tenants and told them their rent would stay the same. Stability builds loyalty, and loyalty is stronger than pride. And in the quiet of my kitchen that night, I lifted my pen and wrote one more line in the ledger. First of the month, his rent will find its way to me. The countermove was no longer theory. It had begun. A man's downfall doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments like the sound of rot beneath the floorboard. Soft at first, then louder with each step, until the whole thing gives way. My uncle's pride was that floorboard, and I had been listening for the creak all along. The first creak came at the diner. I was there early, before the rush, sitting with my black coffee and toast. The kind of breakfast Grandpa liked plain, sturdy, no frills. My uncle walked in loud, his coat swinging, his cigar breath hitting the room before he even spoke. He spotted a few townsfolk near the counter and launched into his usual routine. Maple Street's my crown jewel, he said. Steady income, solid tenants, no trouble at all. I didn't turn my head. I just sipped the coffee, slow, letting the steam rise past my face. A young waitress, new in town, tilted her head and asked, "Isn't that the building where Mr. Callahan—" She looked at me, then back at him. "Handles everything?" The room went still. My uncle's grin faltered. He blinked once, then twice. He barked a laugh, too loud, too brittle. "You must be mistaken," he said. But the seeds had been planted. Doubt had entered the room. The second creak came at the hardware store. A tenant from Maple Street showed up, furious about a past bill my uncle had ignored. She stood at the counter waving a receipt. "You said you'd fix it." "You never did. Mr. Callahan took care of it the other one." Everyone heard, even his employees. My uncle's face flushed purple, his jaw working as if he could chew the words back into silence. But silence had already shifted. For years it had been his weapon. Now it was mine. The third creak was quieter, but deeper. I received a letter from the county routine. Formal, Stamped. It confirmed what I already knew, but still felt good to see in black ink. Taxes on another one of his properties had fallen behind. A warehouse on the edge of town, mostly empty, more burden than asset. Another crack in his crown. I set the letter on the table beside my ledger, smoothing it flat with my palm. The paper felt cool, steady, inevitable. I wrote beneath it, "The walls are shifting. The house leans." What I didn't write, but knew, was this. My uncle had spent his whole life mistaking laughter for strength. He didn't understand that when the room stops laughing with you, it begins laughing at you. And that moment had arrived. I saw it in the diner again a week later. He sat alone, his usual audience scattered to other tables. He picked at his eggs, chewing slow, eyes darting at the door each time it opened. No one asked about Maple Street. No one asked about his empire. Silence had turned on him, heavy and cold. Meanwhile, my silence grew lighter. Each first of the month, envelopes arrived at my boarding house office rent checks, folded neatly, tenant's handwriting steady. Each one carried the same truth. I was collecting what he had sworn I'd never see. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't boast. I just stacked them, logged them, and deposited them. Quiet movements like bricks laid one by one. My uncle never noticed the wall rising until it cast its shadow across his table. That spring, he found me on Main Street, hammer slung in my tool belt, sawdust still on my jacket. He walked up, his voice sharp. "You think you're clever, don't you? Poaching from your own blood?" I looked at him, steady. "I don't poach. I build." His mouth opened, but no words came. The silence stretched, and for the first time, I saw it land on him heavy, the way it always had on me. His smirk cracked. He turned and stormed away, but not before I caught the way his shoulders slumped. Just for a second. That was the moment I knew the floorboard wasn't just creaking anymore. It was about to give. Downfall doesn't always sound like thunder. Sometimes it's the faint scrape of a pen across a check, the shuffle of a man's shoes, as he realizes he's walking into someone else's shadow. My uncle's collapse came that way, quiet, humiliating, written in ink he could never scrub clean. The first time he had to hand me money, it wasn't much. Just a routine rent payment for the warehouse on the edge of town, the one I'd quietly acquired after taxes chewed through his neglect. The county had no patience for unpaid bills, and I had every patience in the world. By the time the notice reached him, the property was already mine. I'll never forget the look on his face when he arrived at my office in the boarding house. His footsteps clomped up the stairs, heavy, resentful. He pushed open the door, filling the frame like a man who still thought size was strength. "Where's the landlord?" he barked. I didn't look up right away. I was writing in the ledger, steady hand, steady ink. When I did raise my eyes, they met his squarely. "You're looking at him." For a moment, he froze. Then he laughed a hollow sound, brittle as cracked glass. "You?" He tossed the check onto the desk. "Fine, cash it, don't get used to it." I slid the check into the folder without a word. Silence is heavier than laughter. He felt it, even if he pretended not to. After that day, the pattern repeated. First of the month, he came with his envelope. His stride grew shorter each time. His voice lost volume. By the third month, he didn't bother with jokes. He just signed, slid the paper forward, and avoided my eyes. Word spread slowly, as it always does in small towns. A tenant at Maple Street mentioned that Mr. Callahan, the quiet one, handles things now. A clerk at the bank whispered about mortgage transfers. The diner crowd noticed who had stopped bragging, and who had started carrying himself with a different weight. One afternoon, I sat in that same diner. My uncle walked in, shoulders hunched, his once booming presence shrunk. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and stared at the floor. No one asked about his empire. No one asked about his properties. They asked me instead about repairs, about rentals, about whether I planned to expand. I answered simply, respectfully. Never with a boast. I let their questions do the talking my uncle used to love. The final crack came in summer. The Maple Street tenants threw a block party kids with chalk on the sidewalks, barbecue smoke curling into the evening sky. They invited me, pressed a plate of ribs into my hands, thanked me for fixing things that had been broken for years. My uncle drove past in his car, window down. I saw his eyes flicker toward the crowd, saw the muscles in his jaw clench. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. He just pressed the gas and rolled on. That night, I wrote one line in the ledger. He pays me to stand where he once stood. It wasn't gloating. It was fact. Because downfall isn't about losing money. It's about losing face. And every first of the month, when his check cleared with my name on the endorsement, he lost a piece of himself. The man who once leaned across a dining table and said, "You'll never see a dollar," Now sign them to me with shaking hands. And that was the silence I'd waited for, the silence where revenge breathes. Revenge, when it's done right, doesn't end with shouting. It ends with stillness, a kind of quiet so heavy that the other man can feel it every time he breathes. By the time my uncle's checks bore my name month after month, the stillness had settled over us both. The ritual became almost comical. First of the month, right after lunch, he'd appear at my office, sometimes with his coat collar pulled high, sometimes with a cap tugged low, as if disguising himself from eyes that had already judged him. He'd step inside, clear his throat, and place the envelope on my desk. "Here," he'd mutter. No swagger, no smirk. Just 2 fingers sliding the paper forward. I'd nod, take it without a word, and slip it into the folder. Then I'd write his name in the ledger with the same steady hand I used when I first began this journey. Every entry was a mirror reminding me of the night I wrote. He said I'd never see a dollar. Now there were dozens of dollars, hundreds, thousands, all carrying his signature. At first he left quickly after paying, slamming the door behind him. But over time he lingered. He'd glance at the wall, at the window, at anything but me. Once, he even asked, "How's business?" I answered simply, "Steady." The word cut deeper than anger ever could, because steady is what he had never been. The town began to see the shift, though no one said it outright. At the diner, people nodded to me first. At the bank, clerks addressed me with respect. Even at the hardware store, his hardware store customers asked if I'd be willing to take on jobs he'd neglected. I never rubbed salt in the wound. I never raised my voice or told a story. I didn't need to. Silence carried the truth better than words, and silence had grown into a weight he couldn't escape. The hardest day for him must have been when he had to bring the check for Grandpa's house. The house he'd once boasted was the jewel of the family line. The porch sagged, the paint peeled, the roof needed mending, taxes piled up, repairs went undone, and when the county came calling, he had no answer. I did. The transfer was simple, quiet, just a line on a deed, stamped and filed. But when he placed that month's rent in my hand, his face changed. Something in him cracked, not anger, not even shame, just recognition. He finally understood. He looked at me for a long moment, eyes wet though he tried to blink it away. "He always liked you better," he whispered, voice graveled. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need confirmation. That night, I drove past the house. The porch boards creaked under my boots the same way they always had. I stood in the doorway, inhaled the smell of dust and old varnish, and laid my hand on the frame Grandpa had built. I thought about every lesson, every nail, every word he'd given me, and I realized this was never about money. It was about dignity. The man who said I'd never see a dollar from Grandpa now wrote my name on checks for the very house he'd stolen with a smirk. And every first of the month, he'd keep writing it, again and again, like a confession he couldn't escape. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And in the whisper, the whole world listens. The end of a revenge story doesn't come with a cheer. It comes with a chair, a table, a cup of coffee cooling as the morning sun cuts across the floor. It comes with a man realizing he no longer has to explain himself, because the proof walks into the room on its own legs every month. That's how mine ended. Years have passed since that day at the lawyer's office, the day my uncle leaned in, breath sour with victory, and whispered that I'd never see a dollar. Those words used to burn at night. Now they sit quiet, like embers gone cold. Every first of the month, he still comes. Sometimes later in the day, sometimes earlier, but always with that envelope. His hair has thinned, his steps slowed. The checks are smaller, now fewer properties left, fewer walls left to lean on. Pride makes a man sell pieces of himself until there's nothing but scraps. He doesn't talk much. Neither do I. Our conversations are a nod, a handover, the scrape of paper against wood. But in that silence, everything is said. The town knows the truth without needing to hear it. They see who fixes broken railings, who pays taxes on time, who shows up when the roof leaks. They see who carries himself steady, and who avoids eyes at the diner. Respect doesn't need announcements. It hangs in the air, heavy as oak. One evening, I walked through the Maple Street apartments, checking boilers, tightening a hinge. A tenant stopped me at the stairwell. She smiled and said, "You remind me of your grandfather. Quiet but solid, like the building safer when you're here." I thanked her, but inside I heard his voice. "You'll do fine, Len." At home, I opened the old ledger, its pages worn, corners curled. The first entry stared back. He said I'd never see a dollar. Beneath it, a lifetime of lines: properties bought, rents collected, debts noted, wrongs righted. A silent book of witness. I touched the ink, closed the cover, and set it on the shelf. The ledger didn't need more words. The story had already written itself in deeds, not just in deeds of paper, but in deeds of action. Revenge, I've learned, isn't about shouting or fists or even gloating. It's about restoring balance, about letting time and silence do what rage never could. My uncle lives now in the shadow of his own arrogance. I live in the steadiness of the lessons Grandpa gave me. Measure twice, cut once, sweep the site clean, even when no one's looking. And every month, when my uncle signs his name and slides that envelope forward, the lesson is carved deeper. Silence isn't weakness. It's the sharpest tool in the box. I don't need applause. I don't need headline. All I need is that moment, his hand letting go of the check, my hand taking it, and the silence between us heavy enough to remind him of every word he ever spoke against me. That silence is my inheritance, and it's worth more than every dollar he thought I'd never see.